So put yourself in a kitchen in 1936. Just picture it. You are sitting at the table, and there is this cheap worn oilcloth covering the wood.
Right.
Like maybe it has a faded floral pattern that's completely rubbed off at the edges from just, years of elbows and anxious scraping.
Yeah, you can really picture that wear and tear.
Exactly. And you look out the frost-edged window onto the street, and the reality of the American landscape just hits you. Every third man walking down that sidewalk is idle.
Just completely severed from the economy.
Right. Nowhere to go, nothing to produce, just utterly stripped of momentum.
And I mean, the sheer suffocating scale of that idleness is it's almost impossible to comprehend today.
It really is.
33% of the men in your sightline entirely removed from the mechanisms of society, just kind of existing in a state of suspended animation.
And for months, maybe years at this point, your household has been surviving on direct relief. And we have to be incredibly specific about what that actually looked like on the ground.
Yeah, it's important to clarify that.
Because it was not a direct deposit quietly slipping into a checking account.
Yeah, not.
It was a grocery order printed on government paper. Or maybe it was a half-ton of coal dumped at your door so your family wouldn't freeze to death in January.
Right. Or a tiny cash allotment.
Yeah, a meager cash allotment that you only secured because you stood in a line wrapping around a brick building, walked up to a county desk, and basically surrendered every ounce of your pride to a local administrator.
And the psychological toll of that. I mean, every single time you handed over that grocery voucher at the local market, or, every time you shoveled that government coal into your stove,
Yeah.
It ate away at your psychological foundation.
Because everyone saw it.
Exactly. The inescapable, glaring fact of that transaction, which is witnessed by your neighbors, the grocer, even your own children, is that no one in your house actually earned it.
It's charity.
It is charity. It is keeping your biological functions going, sure, but it is deeply, systematically eroding your sense of self-worth.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is the exact moment the entire paradigm shifts.
Right.
Someone in your family, let's say it's the father, but could be a widowed mother, or an out-of-work bookkeeper who boards with you, comes walking through the front door.
And they have something with them?
They walk into that kitchen, they approach that worn oilcloth, and they set down an envelope. And inside isn't a voucher. It isn't a ration card. It is a paycheck.
A physical, undeniable testament to labor.
Exactly. It's wages. It's money paid for work actually performed. Maybe they spent the week swinging a pickaxe to grade a dirt road.
Or pouring concrete for a new wing on the local school.
Yeah, or maintaining a municipal ledger, or working in a sprawling federal sewing room. The dollar amount in that envelope is modest.
Very modest.
It is noticeably less than what they would have made doing the exact same task before the stock market evaporated in 1929.
Right. Everyone sitting at that table knows the math.
But the money is theirs. They traded their sweat and their time for it. The second that envelope hits the table, it literally changes the air pressure in the room.
It really does. It creates this profound shift in the gravity of the household. I mean, the quiet, enormous distance between being given something out of institutional pity and earning something through your own agency.
And that exact difference, the moral and psychological distance between the handout and the paycheck, is the entire foundational premise of the Works Progress Administration, the WPA.
It's the core of everything they did.
Today, we are examining a brilliant historical dossier compiled by Nick Mackenzie for a series called The Infinite Dividend. Mackenzie synthesized government records, New Deal scholarship, archival diaries, all to look past the concrete and the steel.
To get to the human element.
Exactly. We are going to unpack the human scale experience of the WPA. Our mission for this deep dive is to weigh the dignity of this massive, unprecedented work relief program against the indignities, the bureaucratic stigmas, and the agonizing compromises that were basically baked into its DNA.
And looking at Mackenzie's dossier, it's wild to see how fiercely organized labor, private business leaders, and the federal government fought over this program.
Oh, the battleground.
Completely. Depending on whose archived letters you read from the time, the people running the WPA were either visionary saviors rescuing the American working class, or they were dangerous radicals destroying the free market.
Right. And just to be clear, for everyone listening, our goal today isn't to judge who was right or wrong on the macroeconomics. We aren't taking political sides here.
No, not at all.
We just want to understand the sheer crushing pressure everyone was operating under and how those policies actually felt to the person holding the shovel.
Yeah, the lived reality of it.
So to understand why that single paycheck on the oilcloth mattered so much, we first have to understand the man and the machinery that looked at a broken nation and decided a job was fundamentally morally superior to cash.
We have to look at the architect of work over welfare, Harry L. Hopkins.
Let's get into Hopkins. Where does he come from?
Well, we need to trace the timeline of how Hopkins arrived at this massive lever of power. By the early 1930s, the initial shock of the crash had turned into a grinding systemic collapse.
Right, the bottom just kept falling.
Yeah, local charities, state relief funds, city soup kitchens, they were completely drained. They simply lacked the tax base or the infrastructure to handle millions of destitute citizens.
They were just overwhelmed.
Completely overwhelmed. So out of pure desperate necessity, direct cash relief, what people derisively called the dole, began to spread.
Because localities just threw whatever pennies they had left at the problem to prevent literal starvation in the streets, right?
Exactly. But with the spread of the dole came this creeping, massive political and moral panic about the whole concept of dependency.
Which brings us to Harry Hopkins.
Enter Harry Hopkins. He was appointed to run the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, and eventually, under the Emergency Relief Appropriation Act of 1935 and Executive Order 7034, he became the head of the newly minted WPA.
But to understand his decisions, you have to look at his background. I mean, he wasn't a banker.
Yeah.
He wasn't a classical economist. He was a former social worker.
Yeah, that is huge.
He had spent his formative professional years in the tenements of New York City, like up close and personal with the actual mechanics of poverty.
And that seems like the most critical piece of his psychology. I mean, a relief administrator who deeply, viscerally distrusts the concept of direct relief.
It sounds like an oxymoron.
It does. But what's fascinating here is that his hatred of the dole wasn't born out of some fiscal conservatism or a desire to save the federal government money.
Really?
Yeah, it was born entirely out of his observations of what the dole did to the human spirit. Hopkins's governing philosophy was that direct cash relief demoralizes a person from the inside out.
It deduces a kind of psychological rot, right?
Exactly. Work, on the other hand, preserves a person's skill, their muscular memory of their trade, and their self-respect.
Okay, so Hopkins is essentially saying that handing someone a grocery voucher keeps their biological body alive, but giving them a job keeps their identity alive.
Yes. He observed it firsthand. He saw that a tradesman kept in his trade, even if he's doing it on a public project funded by a federal deficit, stays a tradesman.
Because he wakes up with a purpose?
Exactly. A man who is merely kept on a relief roll, just waiting for a government handout every Thursday, slowly stops being a tradesman. The calluses on his hands soften. His pride dissolves.
He stops viewing himself as an active participant in society.
Right, and he becomes a passive ward of the state.
It's the ultimate rejection of the macroeconomic theories of the time, because you have classical economists screaming at Hopkins and the Roosevelt administration to just wait.
Oh, yeah, the pressure to do nothing was immense.
They argued that recovery economics demanded patience, like that the business cycle would eventually correct itself, the market would heal, and in the long run, private industry would absorb the unemployed.
They just wanted Hopkins to keep people alive as cheaply as possible on the dole until the magic of the market returned.
Where Hopkins fires back with this incredible, defining rebuttal known as the time argument.
Oh, it's so good. He looked at the economists demanding patience and stated flatly, people don't eat in the long run, they eat every day.
Wow. It's such a devastatingly simple dismantling of ivory tower economics.
It really is.
He's pointing out that macroeconomics can afford the luxury of thinking in business cycles that span 5, 10, or 20 years. A hungry family cannot.
No, a hungry family operates on a strict biological 24-hour cycle.
Hopkins recognized that you just cannot ask a starving man to wait for a statistical trend to reverse.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Hopkins was tapping into a profound existential anxiety in the 1930s about what it meant to be an American.
The cultural mythology, you mean?
Yeah, the entire cultural mythology of the country was built on rugged individualism, the frontier spirit, the Protestant work ethic, the idea of millions of able-bodied citizens becoming a permanent underclass dependent on the state was terrifying to everyone.
Not just conservatives worried about budgets.
Right, but liberals worried about social cohesion, and most importantly, the unemployed people themselves. They despised being dependents. They desperately wanted to be contributors.
They wanted to earn their keep. So the WPA was designed to save their identity just as much as it was designed to save their lives.
Exactly.
And it sounds brilliant on paper, But to get that identity-saving job, you had to walk through an absolute gauntlet of bureaucratic humiliation.
Yeah, preserving dignity was the grand overarching goal, but the actual mechanical process of getting your name onto a WPA payroll required you to strip away almost every layer of your personal privacy.
So let's shatter a huge misconception right now. You couldn't just walk up to a WPA construction site, spot a foreman rolling out blueprints, shake his hand, and ask for a shovel.
No, not at all. It was not an open hiring process.
The WPA was fundamentally a relief program that had been converted into an employment program.
Right, and the gateway between destitution and employment was the means test.
Let's walk through the mechanics of this, because the rules were, frankly, draconian.
They were very strict.
First, a family had to be officially certified as in need by local county or city relief administrators. You had to prove on paper that you were entirely destitute.
And second, and this is a massive structural bottleneck, only one worker per family was allowed to hold a WPA job.
Just one?
Yes. The one worker per family rule had enormous cascading ripple effects across the culture. In practice, because of the strict gender norms and patriarchal structures of the 1930s, that single allowed worker was almost universally designated as the man of the household.
So if a family had a father and a mother, the father was the one certified for the WPA project.
Exactly. This rule fundamentally shaped the gender dynamics of the entire New Deal, largely pushing women to the margins of this massive federal employment effort.
Unless they were single heads of households or widows, or the husband was physically incapacitated, right?
Correct.
It immediately categorized the entire nation's workforce. The father gets the WPA paycheck. The mother is expected to stretch it. But let's zoom in on the psychological toll of that means test.
The humiliation of it.
Yeah, because these workers were drawn directly from the public relief roles. You didn't submit a resume, you know. You submitted to an interrogation.
That's a great way to put it.
You went to the local relief office, the exact same humiliating building you'd been going to for your coal vouchers, and you had to prove to a clerk that you had absolutely nothing left to your name.
The invasiveness of the means test cannot be overstated. You had to open up the deepest, most private corners of your life to a local government administrator.
Like what? What did they ask?
They would scrutinize your savings accounts. They would ask if you had any life insurance policies you could borrow against. They would visit your home to inspect your assets.
They came to your house.
Oh, yeah. They'd look around and say, do you own a radio? A car? Can you sell them? You had to officially, legally perform your poverty.
Wow.
So while transitioning from a relief case to a WPA employee was an elevation in status, it was an elevation that you had to undergo in full public view, stepping right out of the same charity line you'd been standing in for years.
Wait, hang on. If I have this job, but I only got it by officially declaring myself a pauper to a county clerk who literally went through my kitchen cabinets, where's the dignity in that?
That is the paradox.
It's a huge paradox. You are a proud employee swinging a hammer on a work site, but back at the county desk, your file still says relief case.
And this raises an important question about the nature of the labor itself. Was this enrollment truly voluntary?
In what way?
Well, in an era of mass unemployment where literal starvation is a very real possibility, the government comes along and says, we are phasing out the cash dole, but we will give you a job if you prove you're desperate enough.
It introduces a profound element of soft coercion.
Exactly. You didn't really have a choice but to submit to the degradation of the means test if you wanted your family to survive.
And the terror didn't end once you got the job either, because of what the dossier calls the recertification trap.
Right. The initial certification wasn't permanent. Workers were subject to constant rolling reexaminations of their poverty level.
The bureaucracy always needed to ensure you were still poor enough to deserve the work.
They were constantly checking up on you.
This completely fractures the dignity argument for me. How does a worker actually feel a lasting sense of pride when they know, in the back of their mind, that a local administrator could just show up, review their file, decide the family isn't needy enough anymore because maybe they managed to save $5 in a coffee can and just rip the job away next week?
The dignity was incredibly fragile.
I would be terrified all the time.
And you are right. The terror was a constant companion. The household's economic security was never truly settled. Every time an inspector knocked on the door or every time a recertification notice arrived in the mail, the anxiety was suffocating.
because it constantly reminded the worker that their status as an employee was entirely conditional upon their continued performance of poverty.
You had to stay just poor enough to keep the job that was supposed to pull you out of poverty.
It's a maddening bureaucratic loop.
It really is. And that fragility, the fact that the government wielded absolute control over your employment status based on your level of need, leads perfectly into how the federal government also strictly controlled what that job actually paid.
They had to ensure the WPA never became a permanent, comfortable career.
Which brings us to the most fiercely debated, strategically explosive number of the entire New Deal era, the security wage.
Let's lay out the exact mechanics of this balancing act, because the friction here is incredible. The WPA set a specific monthly wage for its workers.
Right, the security wage.
And this wage was deliberately mathematically set above what a family would receive if they just stayed on direct relief.
That was Harry Hopkins's direct influence. The wage had to pay more than the dole to ensure that the incentive to work was always mathematically undeniable. Labor had to be rewarded.
But, and this is a massive structural body, it was deliberately set below prevailing private market wages, and notably below union wages.
This was the grand compromise of the New Deal. The logic dictated that the federal government could not, under any circumstances, be seen as competing with private business for labor.
Because if the WPA paid the same or more than a private construction firm, workers would just abandon the private sector.
Exactly. They'd flock to government jobs and the private market would never recover. The WPA was designed to be a safety net to catch you when you fell, not a permanent hammock.
So what does this all mean? It's like the government is throwing you a life preserver because you are drowning in the middle of the ocean, but they intentionally deflate that life preserver by 20%.
That's a great analogy.
It keeps your head above water, but it's just uncomfortable enough that you don't forget you need to keep swimming desperately toward a private boat.
That is the exact intended mechanism. They wanted to keep you afloat, but they wanted you to eagerly jump ship the moment a private employer offered you a solid deck to stand on.
But if I'm a labor union leader in 1935, if I'm sitting in the headquarters of the American Federation of Labor, I am looking at this deflated life preserver and I am in a state of absolute strategic panic.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the federal government is basically setting a massive nationwide discount wage standard.
Organized labor was apoplectic. Leaders in the AFL, like William Green, supported the abstract concept of relief. They desperately wanted their out-of-work members to survive, but they vehemently, aggressively fought the implementation of the security wage.
Because it threatens decades of blood, sweat, and strikes. The unions had spent generations fighting to establish prevailing wage floors.
Right.
And now the government steps in as the largest employer in the country and says, we're going to hire millions of men, but we're going to pay them a fraction of what you say they deserve.
The AFL's terror was entirely rational. Their fear was that private employers would look at the WPA rate and use it as a weapon.
Like a bargaining chip.
Exactly. A private contractor would say, well, if the federal government says a carpenter's labor is only worth this much on a security wage, why should I pay the union rate? They feared the WPA would act as a giant anchor, dragging the entire private labor market floor down and destroying the bargaining power of the unions.
It is the WPA's single sharpest bind. Every single choice they made to protect one economic principle inherently bruised another.
The tragedy of the policy is that there was no clean mathematical answer. If Hopkins paid a fair, prevailing union wage, business leaders and conservatives in Congress would annihilate the program for destroying the private labor market and socializing the workforce.
Right, they'd shut it down.
But by paying the sub-prevailing security wage, they protected private business but completely alienated organized labor and fundamentally shortchanged the very workers they were trying to uplift.
And the mechanics of that paycheck get even more complicated because this security wage wasn't just one flat universal number handed down from Washington, right?
Not at all. There were wild regional and skill-based variations.
The wage schedule was a complex, highly localized matrix. Skilled work naturally paid more than unskilled work. But the geographical disparities were staggering, and they were intentionally baked into the system.
Yeah, the security wage was noticeably intentionally lower in the South than it was in the industrial North.
And who is actually deciding these variations on the ground?
Well, the federal government set broad regional guidelines, but they delegated immense power to local relief administrators to classify workers and determine the local cost of living.
And right there is the mechanism for systemic racism to get stamped directly onto a federal paycheck.
Precisely. The federal government didn't explicitly write, pay black workers less into the statute. They wrote, local cost of living adjustments and skill classifications are determined by local boards.
And those local county boards, particularly in the Jim Crow South, simply utilize that bureaucratic discretion to entrench existing racial pay gaps.
Right. A local clerk could look at a black master carpenter with 20 years of experience, check a box labeled unskilled manual labor, and instantly slash his federally funded paycheck to the lowest possible tier.
Which was already geographically depressed compared to the North.
Exactly. The WPA offered a lifeline, but it was a lifeline perfectly contoured to the existing prejudices and inequalities of the local geography.
It completely shatters the illusion of a monolithic federal program. You have a paycheck, but the size of that paycheck depends on whether the local clerk respects you, what color your skin is, what state you happen to live in.
It's all intentionally smaller than what you'd make in a fair market.
It's wild. It must have influenced local perceptions deeply.
It did. In areas where local administration was relatively fair, the WPA was seen as a godsend. In others, it was viewed with deep suspicion, almost as a tool of exploitation dressed up as relief.
But to understand the full scope of why the unions were so terrified of this wage busting, we have to realize that this sub-prevailing wage wasn't just being paid to guys digging ditches or breaking rocks.
No, the tentacles of the WPA reached into demographics you wouldn't expect.
The demographic makeup of the WPA worker is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of the entire Great Depression narrative.
It really is.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When you hear WPA, the instant cultural image that pops into your head is a guy in a flat cap, covered in dirt, wiping his brow, leaning on a shovel.
A manual laborer building a dam or a road.
Right. It is the enduring, monumental stereotype of the New Deal. But we need to shatter that stereotype completely.
Because the reality of eligibility for the WPA, as we discussed with the means test, turned entirely on need.
It did not turn on collar color.
No, the Great Depression was an equal opportunity destroyer. It didn't just throw manual laborers out of work, it decimated the American middle class.
It threw white-collar professionals out onto the street by the hundreds of thousands.
Banks failed, wiping out managers and accountants. Municipalities went bankrupt, closing schools and firing teachers. Private engineering firms collapsed.
And because the WPA's net was cast based purely on who showed up on the relief rolls, they ended up certifying an incredibly wide, diverse swath of society.
We are talking about clerks, bookkeepers, draftsmen.
We're talking about registered nurses whose hospitals could no longer pay them.
And through a sprawling sub-program that became known as Federal One, they also employed writers, actors, musicians, and artists.
This reframes the entire legacy of the program for me. We always picture the physical infrastructure, the miles of concrete and steel. But they were essentially funding an emergency middle-class infrastructure, too.
Keeping teachers teaching in adult education programs.
Keeping nurses nursing in public health clinics.
If we connect this back to Harry Hopkins's core logic, it makes perfect, cohesive sense. Remember his philosophy. The dole destroys specialized skill, work preserves it. If you have a laid-off accountant and you hand him a grocery voucher for 2 years, he loses his edge. He loses his self-respect, his mind dulls, and his highly specialized skills atrophy.
Yeah, he forgets how to balance complex ledgers because he's spending all his cognitive energy worrying about where his family's next meal is coming from.
Exactly. But if you take that same accountant, you put him through the means test, and you pay him a security wage to keep municipal water records for the city or to inventory county archives, you arrest that decay.
He retains his skill.
He retains his professional identity. When the private economy finally recovers, he isn't a broken man. He is a sharp, functioning professional ready to step right back into a private firm.
The WPA wasn't just building things. It was a massive holding pattern for the American workforce's specialized skills.
It was an incubator for human capital.
But I want to compare the lived experiences here because the friction of this must have been bizarre. You have highly skilled professionals and unskilled manual laborers occupying the exact same relief ecosystem.
Yeah, they both had to go through the humiliating means test at the same county desk.
They both received a security wage. But their daily realities and the psychological toll of the work must have been radically different.
The contrast was sharp. For the manual laborer, the WPA often meant brutal, physically exhausting exertion, sometimes in dangerous conditions, building massive infrastructure projects.
And for the white-collar professional?
Well, the physical toll was obviously less, but the psychological shock, The sheer vertigo of finding themselves on a relief project, sometimes rubbing shoulders with unskilled laborers, navigating a system built for the destitute, was profound.
The sudden, staggering loss of status.
Yes. Imagine a former bank manager suddenly sitting at a rickety desk in a drafty, repurposed municipal building, compiling historical records or transcribing oral histories for the WPA.
They had to swallow a massive amount of pride.
They did, yet they were able to maintain their professional identity in a way that handing them a pickaxe and sending them to a rock quarry wouldn't have allowed.
And because of this incredibly broad eligibility, the WPA ended up leaving this bizarrely diverse, culturally rich legacy. It's not just the 650,000-mile road network they paved.
No, they built Coit Tower in San Francisco.
They expanded the Oakland Zoo. They staged federal theater productions that toured the country, employing out-of-work stagehands and directors.
They sent out-of-work writers across the country to compile the famous WPA guidebooks for every single state.
They were laying down both a physical and a cultural backbone for the country simultaneously. The sheer breadth of the output is staggering.
And it was only possible because their primary mandate was to hire anyone who was in need, regardless of their professional background, and try to match them with a task that fit their skills.
But here is the fatal catch to all of this productivity.
There's always a catch.
Whether you were out there macadamizing one of those dirt rows in the blazing August sun, or you were standing on a stage acting in a WPA play, or painting a massive mural in a post office lobby, the work was happening in public.
And that visibility, which was intentionally designed into the program, became its greatest, most corrosive vulnerability.
Visibility is tricky. Hopkins and the Roosevelt administration desperately wanted the public to see the WPA working.
Right. They needed taxpayers to see that their deficit spending wasn't just disappearing into a shadowy Washington bureaucracy.
It was physically building the sidewalk right outside their house.
They needed the tangible, unavoidable output to justify the massive political capital they were expending. But when you put millions of desperate people to work in the public square, you invite intense, unyielding public scrutiny.
And this is where the ugly, lingering side of the WPA's legacy really takes root. Let's look at the mechanics of this scrutiny.
Okay.
If a crew is working on a road and they are moving slowly, maybe because they lack heavy machinery and are doing it by hand, or maybe because they're literally malnourished from years of grinding poverty. A guy driving by in his private car doesn't see the nuance.
He doesn't see the lack of steam shovels.
He just sees 10 guys standing around a pothole leaning on their tools.
And instantly they are judged. The public gaze was often incredibly unforgiving, and politically motivated critics seized on that imagery immediately.
This is where we get the birth of the negative stereotypes that still echo today. We have to talk about the word boondoggle.
It is a word inextricably, permanently linked to the WPA in the American historical consciousness.
Critics in the press and conservatives in Congress who hated the New Deal weaponized this public visibility. They coined the term boondoggle to describe projects they felt were useless, taxpayer-funded make-work.
They ran endless, brutal political cartoons in the daily newspapers,
depicting WPA workers as lazy, shiftless men leaning on shovels, doing nothing while draining the public treasury.
The acronym WPA literally hardened into a national punchline. There were jokes about it. In every diner and barbershop, people would say it stood for "we pedal around" or "we poke along."
That is just so deeply unfair when you look at the actual output. But we have to weigh the fairness of the criticism. Was it all just right-wing propaganda against the Roosevelt administration, or was there actual truth to the inefficiency?
The honest historical answer is that it was a complex mix, driven by the very mechanics of the program.
What do you mean?
Well, we have to acknowledge that a relief program built primarily to maximize the number of jobs it provided, sometimes intentionally, by design, minimized mechanical efficiency.
Explain the mechanism of that. Why would a government program want to be inefficient?
Well, look at the budget. If you are a local WPA administrator and you have a budget to build a road, and your primary moral goal is to employ as many starving men in your county as possible, you don't use your budget to buy a state-of-the-art steam shovel that can do the work of 50 men.
You hire 50 men.
You hire 50 men, you buy them 50 hand shovels, and you tell them to dig.
Wow. Okay, so inefficiency was actually a feature, not a bug, of the program's design. It was labor-intensive on purpose.
Precisely. To the guy driving by in his car, it looked like a ridiculous, slow, inefficient way to build a road. To Hopkins, it looks like 50 families who get to eat dinner that night.
That makes total sense.
And of course, in a program employing millions of people across a vast continent, There were genuine abuses.
Sure.
There was local corruption. There were instances of political patronage where local machine bosses used WPA jobs to buy votes and loyalty. There were absolutely crews that loafed.
But the brush they were painted with was so broad, and the political cartoons were so loud, that it shifted the entire public perception of these workers.
It really did.
Remember that envelope on the kitchen table we started with? The one that was supposed to bring dignity.
The public perception shifted from viewing these men and women as honorable employees contributing to their community back to viewing them as charity cases.
But this time, charity cases who were actively wasting tax dollars.
It's a tragic inversion. Much of that critique was so deeply unfair to the millions of workers who were genuinely, desperately glad for the labor, who took immense pride in the stone bridges they were building and the records they were archiving.
Let's bring it back to that kitchen table for a second. Think about the emotional cost on the family.
It must have been crushing.
The father goes out, works a grueling 10-hour day doing hard labor in the sun, and brings home his security wage. And his neighbors, the exact same neighbors who might have respected that he was finally earning a paycheck instead of taking a grocery voucher, are now reading cartoons in the evening paper about shovel-leaners.
The neighbors might be whispering over the fence about where that paycheck came from. Oh, he's just on the WPA. He's not really working. He's just on the government dole with a shovel in his hand.
It creates a new, incredibly specific kind of stigma. If the whole point of Hopkins's grand, expensive experiment was to save these workers from the shame of the dole, didn't the shovel-leaner punchline, the boondoggle label, just invent a brand new, arguably more public type of shame for them to carry?
It's a painful, inescapable irony. They escaped the private shame of the relief handout only to walk right into the glaring public shame of the make-work punchline.
They were caught.
They were caught between the necessity of survival and the harsh judgment of a society that prized private enterprise above all else.
Which brings us to the ultimate ledger we have to try and balance here.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to grasp the sheer, staggering scale of what we are discussing. Between 1935 and 1943, when the program was finally liquidated as the wartime economy of World War II absorbed the unemployed, over 8.5 million Americans drew a WPA paycheck.
8.5 million individuals. And at its peak, in late 1938, there were roughly 3.3 million people employed by the WPA at the exact same time.
That is just an incredible workforce.
And even then, millions more were still languishing on waiting lists because the need was so vast that even this massive machinery couldn't absorb everyone.
So we are talking about a program that touched a massive percentage of the American population directly and touched nearly everyone indirectly through the infrastructure they built and the art they created.
So knowing the immense scale, knowing the draconian rules, knowing the humiliation of the means test, the strategic anger of the unions over the security wage, and the stinging stigma of the shovel-leaner, what is the honest verdict? Was
What?
Mary Hopkins right?
The historical consensus and the deeply human conclusion Mackenzie's dossier points us toward is that Hopkins's dignity argument wasn't necessarily wrong. A paycheck does carry a fundamentally different psychological weight than a coal voucher. But that dignity was exceptionally, heartbreakingly expensive.
Expensive in human terms, not just federal dollars.
Exactly that. It was paid for in the indignity of invasive means tests where you had to perform your poverty. It was paid for in the suffocating anxiety of endless recertifications.
And the union betrayal.
Right. It was paid for in what organized labor viewed as a massive betrayal via the submarket security wage. And it was paid for by carrying a job title that became a national joke whispered about by neighbors.
The WPA offered a job instead of a handout. But it forced the worker to carry the immense, crushing social cost of that distinction.
It was a monumental achievement in keeping a desperate nation afloat and preserving the skills of its workforce, but the emotional tax levied on those workers was profound.
And this is where I want to turn it over to you, the listener, because this isn't just dry history locked in a 1930s archive. The tension we've been dissecting today is still remarkably alive.
Very much so.
I want you to consider the central question of this deep dive. Was the dignity worth the indignities?
It's a question without an easy, clean answer. If you were sitting at that kitchen table, staring at that worn oilcloth, would you willingly trade your privacy, endure the means test, and face the public mockery of the boondoggle label, just to be able to say, you earned your bread?
And challenge yourself to think about how we still, right now, in the present day, place intense, often unspoken moral judgments on how people receive government assistance versus how they earn a wage.
The arguments Harry Hopkins was having in 1935 about dependency versus work are the exact same fundamental arguments we see echoing in policy debates today.
The language is modernized, but the deep moral unease about dependency hasn't changed a bit.
This raises an important question, and it's something I want to leave everyone to mull over as they go about their day, perhaps driving over a bridge or walking through a park built by those very WPA workers.
Give it to us.
By prioritizing the moral act of working over the actual economic efficiency or market value of the work itself, by creating a massive nationwide system where simply having a job was elevated as the ultimate moral good, did the WPA permanently alter the American cultural psyche?
Did the Great Depression and the machinery of the WPA embed a permanent, unspoken rule in our society? A rule that says human dignity is intrinsically, inextricably tied to being on a payroll, no matter what the job actually entails, and no matter how poorly it pays.
It's the human scale foundation of everything we understand about the morality of work in this country.
And it is the cultural backbone for everything we are going to explore as we continue to walk across the physical legacy of the WPA in future deep dives. We'll be looking at the monuments, the roads, the art, and the architecture. But never forget the invisible psychological price paid by the person holding the shovel, the pen, or the paintbrush. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.